Arsenic for Tea, Part 2, Chapter 3. All morning we followed Mr. Curtis as best we could. We had to carry on doing birthday things with Kitty and Beanie and playing games that had been set up by Miss Alston, most of them memory games that Daisy was sure to win. But during bun break, I think Daisy only insisted on it so she could run about the house for a few minutes, but I appreciated the buttery shortbread baked by Mrs. Doherty very much. We came upon him on the first floor, peering at something on a table. It was one of Lady Hastings' heavy old jewelled brooches. I saw his face and there was greed all over it. "Oh, goodness, I forgot I left that there. Is it worth anything?" Lady Hastings asked behind him. "Well," said Mr. Curtis, "such an unfashionable cut in such a setting. You might be able to get £1 or £2 for it, perhaps. There isn't the demand for such things these days." Again, what he was saying and how he was looking did not match up at all. It was highly suspicious. Just before lunch, we saw him go past the door of the music room, out into the garden, and although the sun had gone in and the sky was fat and grey with cloud, Daisy suddenly decided that the one thing in the world she wanted to do was go and play in the maze. Kitty, who hates getting her hair wet, predictably said no. I wished I was allowed to agree with her, and Beanie loyally said she would stay with Kitty. So it was only Daisy and I who rushed out of the front door a few moments later. We turned left onto the front lawn and saw that we were in luck. Mr. Curtis was actually disappearing into the maze. "After him!" hissed Daisy, and down the lawn we dashed into the close green spiked tunnels. I could hear Mr. Curtis up ahead, stamping along, but every path looked just the same, and just as wrong, and I wasn't sure which way to go. Daisy, though, seized hold of my hand and dragged me forward, Privet pulling at our skirts and socks, until I was sure that Mr. Curtis would hear us, or worse, run into us. But Daisy, of course, knew exactly what she was about. She came to a sudden stop inches from a flat green wall, and there on the other side I heard voices. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Curtis sounded furious. All the oil had gone out of his voice. "I was going to meet—" "Margaret?" Uncle Felix sounded perfectly silky. "I don't think that's a terribly good idea under the circumstances, do you?" My heart began to thump, and I tried not to look at Daisy. I had been hoping to avoid any more mention of Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings. "Are you warning me?" asked Mr. Curtis. "Nothing so gauche. However, if you choose to take it as that, I won't contradict you. I think it would be best for all concerned if you left this house as soon as possible. If you stay, well, you might not like what happens." Mr. Curtis snorted. "You can't touch me," he said. "Can't I? I think I can. You see, I know what you're really here for." There was a very cold silence on the other side of the hedge. My heart leaped into my mouth. What did Uncle Felix mean? Was he simply telling Mr. Curtis that he knew about him and Lady Hastings? He could be, but it sounded to me like something more. "And what's that?" asked Mr. Curtis, all bluster. I could almost see him throwing back his shoulders and jutting out his well-defined chin. "You know," said Uncle Felix. His voice made me shiver. "You know very well." Daisy was elbowing me frantically, mouth wide open. Mr. Curtis cursed filthily, and I felt the privet wall in front of us shiver. Then off he went like a shambling bear, growling away to himself and making the maze around him shake. He was very easy to follow, though as we ran after him everything seemed doubled and confused. I heard our footsteps and his, and what I thought must be Uncle Felix's just to the left of us, or just behind. But then I heard Uncle Felix to our right, muttering to himself. It gave me a horrid jump. Who had we heard before? At last we burst out of the maze, and there, coming down from the house towards it, was Lady Hastings. So it had not been her in the maze. She was peering up at the sky and teetering along in her high heels. "Where's Mr. Curtis?" I gasped. We heard a noise and turned, but it was not Mr. Curtis we saw coming out of the maze either. It was Miss Alston. Her face looked strangely flushed, and her handbag was dangling from her arm. The mystery was solved. "Daisy," she said. "Hazel, there you are. Where did you get to?" Then Mr. Curtis burst out of the maze, panting and red-faced. He saw Miss Alston and started. I am quite sure, although she covered it very well, that she started too, as if guilty. What had she been doing? Mr. Curtis was looking very angry indeed. He glared at Miss Alston and then pointed a furious finger into her face so that she had to step back. "I know what you are," he growled. "I know what you're here for. Well, you'll have to do better than that if you want to catch me out. Ha!" Then he saw Lady Hastings and stared from her to Miss Alston, as though he wasn't sure how much she had heard and what she would make of it. "I don't know what you're talking about," said Miss Alston steadily. "Girls, do come inside. I believe it is beginning to rain." Of course, we had to be good and follow her, dodging raindrops as we went, but my heart was jumping about with excitement. What had Mr. Curtis meant about Miss Alston? We had seen her watching him suspiciously earlier, after all. Daisy poked me, and I could tell that she was having exactly the same thoughts. The stone walls of the house closed in around us, with a chill I could feel through my dress. Kitty and Beanie were hovering about in the hall, Beanie looking shy and out of place, and Kitty very cross. "You've been ages," she said to us accusingly. "We're bored, I say—" But just then the dining room door swung open, and Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings came out. They must have got in from the garden, through the French windows. It was odd seeing them again so soon. I stiffened, and Daisy clenched her fists tight against her skirt. "Give me a week's warning at least. I can't simply go," Lady Hastings was saying heatedly. Then she saw us and stopped with a jerk. "Girls," she said. "Daisy, Miss Alston, didn't I just now tell you to keep them amused?" "My apologies, Lady Hastings," said Miss Alston colourlessly. "Girls, time for another round of birthday games, I think." "Oh, goody," said Daisy, not taking her eyes off her mother. Lady Hastings blushed, then she cleared her throat and said, "Good. Lunch is at 1. Oh, and Daisy, happy birthday." "Thank you, Mummy. Are you going somewhere?" "No," said Lady Hastings, who had suddenly seen something very interesting on the ceiling. "Poor Mr. Curtis has been called away on business, and I was persuading him to stay. You must have misunderstood." "Oh dear, I must have," said Daisy. "How silly of me." We all followed Miss Alston into the music room for our games, Daisy craning round behind her as subtly as she could to look at her mother and Mr. Curtis. "Hazel," she hissed in my ear, "Mr. Curtis is becoming more and more bold. We have to keep a watch on him. There's no telling what he might do next." I thought I could guess. Mr. Curtis was leaving that night, and he wanted Lady Hastings to go with him. If Daisy used even half of her detective skills on the problem, she would know that. But it was her birthday, and you are allowed to pretend certain things on your birthday. "We will," I said, and I reached out and gave her fingers a squeeze. Daisy squeezed back. "Good old Hazel," she said. "I knew I could count on you."